The morning I found the anxiety medication hidden in my husband's gym bag, I thought he was trying to help me. How naive I was to believe that Michael Reed, the man who promised to love me through sickness and health, was actually orchestrating my destruction one pill at a time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the moment I realized that the person sleeping next to me every night had been systematically convincing everyone I knew that I was losing my mind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scent of vanilla candles and freshly brewed coffee should have made that Saturday morning feel peaceful. Instead, as I stood in my kitchen wearing the yellow sundress Michael had complimented just weeks before, I felt like an actress who had forgotten her lines. The farmer's market flowers I'd arranged so carefully seemed to mock me with their vibrant colors, a stark contrast to the growing darkness I couldn't quite name. My name is Emma Chen, and until 6 months ago, I thought I had the perfect life in Riverside, California. At 32, I was living in a dream that many would envy. I taught English literature at Riverside High School, where students actually seemed to enjoy my classes about Shakespeare and Steinbeck. My colleagues respected me, parents praised my dedication during conferences, and I genuinely loved watching teenagers discover the power of words. After school, I'd come home to our charming house on Maplewood Drive, with its white picket fence and garden that I'd spent 3 years perfecting. Michael had swept me off my feet during my first year teaching. He was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. Confident without being arrogant, successful in real estate but not obsessed with money, and he had this way of making me feel like I was the most fascinating woman in any room. He'd bring me surprise lunches at school, remember small details about my day, and always knew exactly what to say when I was stressed about difficult students or demanding parents. Our wedding 2 years later felt like a fairy tale, complete, with Patricia Reed, his mother, tearfully welcoming me into their close-knit family. But fairy tales, I was learning, often hide the most sinister truths. The changes started so gradually that I convinced myself I was imagining things. It began with small incidents that Michael would later use as evidence of my declining mental state. I'd misplace my car keys and find them in strange locations, like the refrigerator or my jewelry box. My phone would mysteriously die even though I was certain I'd charged it overnight. Appointments I was sure I'd written in my calendar would vanish, leaving me scrambling to reschedule and apologize profusely to confused doctors and hairstylists. "You're working too hard, sweetheart," Michael would say, wrapping his arms around me with what felt like genuine concern. "Teaching is so stressful. Maybe you should consider seeing someone just to talk through the pressure you're under." His voice carried that perfect balance of love and worry that made me feel grateful rather than defensive. He wasn't criticizing me. He was caring for me. At least that's what I told myself during those early months when doubt was just a whisper, rather than a scream. The forgetfulness escalated in ways that began affecting my professional life. I'd arrive at faculty meetings convinced they were scheduled for Wednesday, only to discover they'd been moved to Thursday and everyone had received the memo except me. Lesson plans I'd spent hours perfecting would disappear from my computer, forcing me to recreate them from memory while students waited impatiently. My principal, Dr. Martinez, began asking if everything was all right at home, her expression mixing concern with the kind of professional wariness that made my stomach churn. "I'm fine," I'd insist, even as I secretly wondered if maybe I wasn't. Just a lot going on lately. The truth was, I couldn't understand what was happening to me. I'd always been organized, reliable, the type of person who made lists and stuck to schedules. Suddenly, I felt like I was living in someone else's chaotic life, constantly playing catch-up with responsibilities that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Michael's support during this period felt like a lifeline. He'd rub my shoulders when I came home exhausted from another day of professional embarrassment. He'd cook dinner when I was too overwhelmed to think about meal planning. Most importantly, He'd listen without judgment when I confessed my growing fears about my own competence. "Maybe you should talk to someone professional," he'd suggest gently, his hand stroking my hair as we sat on our couch. "There's no shame in getting help. You're under so much stress, and sometimes an outside perspective can really clarify things." His tone was so reasonable, so loving, that I found myself nodding along even when part of me resisted the idea that I needed psychiatric intervention. The suggestion became more frequent as my apparent symptoms worsened. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard someone in our house, only to find all the doors locked and Michael sleeping peacefully beside me. I'd discover items moved in our home, books filed in wrong sections, pictures slightly askew, coffee mugs in cabinets where I never put them. When I mentioned these observations to Michael, he'd look at me with such gentle patience that I felt ashamed for even bringing them up. "Honey, I think you might be having some anxiety-related episodes," he'd say, his voice carrying the careful tone people use with fragile individuals. "You've been under so much pressure at work, and sometimes our minds play tricks on us when we're overwhelmed." He'd show me articles about stress-induced memory problems and anxiety disorders, highlighting passages that seemed to describe my exact experiences. I was a woman who had graduated summa cum laude from college, earned a master's degree in education, and successfully managed a classroom of 30 teenagers for 6 years. How had I become someone who couldn't remember where she parked her car, or keep track of her own belongings? "I think we should make an appointment with Dr. Johnson," Michael said as we pulled into our driveway, his voice gentle but firm. "This is getting serious, Emma. Today was really difficult for everyone, and I'm worried about you." Dr. Johnson had been our family physician for years, a kind man in his 60s who had treated everything from my sinus infections to Michael's sports injuries. The idea of discussing my mental health with him felt both appropriate and terrifying. Part of me desperately wanted answers, some medical explanation for what was happening to my mind. Another part of me feared that seeking help would confirm everyone's worst suspicions about my deteriorating condition. "Maybe you're right," I agreed, though the words felt like admitting defeat. "I can't keep living like this. Something is definitely wrong, and I need to figure out what it is before it gets worse." Michael squeezed my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "We'll figure this out together," he promised, his eyes meeting mine with what looked like genuine love and concern. "You're not alone in this, Emma. Whatever is happening, we'll handle it as a team." That night, as I lay in bed listening to Michael's steady breathing, I tried to piece together the timeline of my mental decline. 6 months ago, I'd been confident, capable, successful. I'd received excellent performance reviews at work, maintained meaningful friendships, and felt genuinely happy in my marriage. Now I was afraid to trust my own perceptions, constantly second-guessing my memory and questioning my sanity. The transformation had been so gradual that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started or identify any triggering event. There had been no trauma, no major life changes, no obvious stressors beyond the normal challenges of adult life. My health had always been excellent, my family history free of mental illness, my lifestyle balanced and moderate. Yet here I was, lying awake at 2 a.m, wondering if I was losing my mind while my husband slept peacefully beside me, probably dreaming about the burden of being married to a woman who could no longer be trusted to remember basic facts about her own life. What I didn't know, as I finally drifted off to sleep that night, was that Michael wasn't sleeping at all. He was lying there calculating, planning, and probably congratulating himself on another successful performance. The man I trusted most in the world, the person I'd turned to for comfort and guidance through my darkest moments, was the architect of every single moment of confusion and self-doubt I'd experienced. But I wouldn't discover that truth for several more weeks. And when I did, it would change everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the person I'd chosen to share my life with. The fairy tale I'd been living was about to reveal itself as the most sophisticated psychological warfare I could have ever imagined, And I was about to learn that sometimes the person trying to save you is the same person who pushed you into the water in the first place. The appointment with Dr. Johnson was scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving me 3 days to prepare for what felt like a formal evaluation of my sanity. During those days, I found myself hyper-aware of every small mistake, every moment of confusion, cataloging them like evidence against my own mental competence. When I put salt in my coffee instead of sugar Monday morning, I wondered if this was another symptom Dr. Johnson would need to know about. When I walked into the living room and momentarily forgot why I'd gone there, I questioned whether this represented normal human behavior or something more concerning. Michael was exceptionally attentive during this waiting period, treating me with the careful kindness usually reserved for people recovering from serious illnesses. He took over grocery shopping, claiming he wanted to reduce my stress levels. He handled all phone calls, explaining to anyone who asked that I was going through a difficult time and needed space to focus on my health. Most touchingly, he began, leaving little notes in my lunch bag, sweet reminders of his love and support that made my colleagues comment on what a devoted husband I had. The notes were simple but meaningful. "You're stronger than you know," written in his careful handwriting on yellow sticky paper. "Remember that I love you no matter what," tucked between my sandwich and apple. "Today will be better than yesterday," attached to my water bottle. These small gestures felt like lifelines during a period when I was drowning in self-doubt, and I saved every single note in a small box on my nightstand. At school, my performance had stabilized somewhat, though I remained hypervigilant about every interaction and responsibility. I arrived early each morning to double-check my lesson plans, stayed late to ensure all papers were graded and properly filed, and maintained detailed written records of every assignment and deadline. My colleagues noticed my increased attention to documentation, and several commented positively on my thorough organization. "You've really stepped up your game this semester," said Jennifer Martinez, the mathematics teacher whose classroom was next to mine. "I don't know how you keep track of everything so perfectly. I can barely remember what I taught yesterday." Her compliment should have felt encouraging, but instead it highlighted the exhausting hypervigilance that had become necessary for me to function at even a basic level. The irony wasn't lost on me that my professional life was improving precisely because I was overcompensating for my personal mental struggles. I was working twice as hard to achieve the same results I'd once accomplished effortlessly, but at least the extra effort was producing visible success. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Parents complimented my detailed feedback on their children's essays. Students appreciated the carefully structured lessons that left no room for confusion or missed information. My principal mentioned during a brief hallway conversation that she'd received several positive comments about my teaching this semester. Dr. Johnson's office smelled like antiseptic and old magazines, a combination that immediately transported me back to childhood visits for routine checkups and vaccinations. The waiting room contained the usual collection of outdated periodicals and medical pamphlets about various conditions, none of which seemed relevant to my particular situation. I found myself reading an article about diabetes prevention while internally rehearsing how to explain my symptoms to a man who had known me for years as a healthy, stable individual. Michael accompanied me to the appointment, settling into the chair beside mine with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to medical waiting rooms. He held my hand while we waited, occasionally squeezing gently when other patients were called back ahead of us. His presence felt both comforting and slightly overwhelming, as if he were there to monitor my responses as much as to provide support. "Mrs. Reed," the nurse called, and I followed her back through the familiar corridors to Dr. Johnson's consultation room. The walls were decorated with medical diagrams and motivational posters about healthy living, creating an atmosphere that was meant to be reassuring, but felt vaguely intimidating given the circumstances. Dr. Johnson entered with the warm smile I remembered from previous visits, his gray hair perfectly combed and his white coat pristine despite what had probably been a busy morning. He delivered the news about my excellent cholesterol levels just 6 months earlier, complimented my blood pressure readings, and declared me to be in outstanding health for someone my age. Now he was here to evaluate whether my mind was betraying me in ways my body never had. "Emma, Michael," he greeted us both, settling behind his desk with my file spread open before him. "Michael explained on the phone that you've been experiencing some concerning symptoms. Why don't you tell me what's been happening?" The next 30 minutes felt like confessing to crimes I wasn't sure I'd committed. I described the memory lapses, the misplaced objects, the growing confusion about simple tasks and familiar routines. Dr. Johnson listened with the professional attention I'd expected, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timing, frequency, and specific details. Michael supplemented my account with observations about incidents I'd forgotten or minimized, his voice carrying the concerned objectivity of someone who'd been carefully documenting my decline. "She's been working so hard lately," Michael explained when Dr. Johnson asked about potential stressors. "Teaching is incredibly demanding, and Emma puts so much pressure on herself to be perfect. I've been worried that she's heading toward some kind of breakdown from the stress." Dr. Johnson nodded thoughtfully, making notes in my file as we spoke. "Stress can certainly manifest in physical and cognitive symptoms," he agreed. "Teaching is one of the most psychologically demanding professions, especially for someone with Emma's perfectionist tendencies." The phrase perfectionist tendencies hit me like a diagnosis I hadn't expected. Was my attention to detail and high standards actually a psychological flaw that was contributing to my current problems? I'd always considered my thoroughness and dedication to be professional strengths, but perhaps they were actually symptoms of an underlying anxiety disorder that was finally overwhelming my ability to cope. "I'd like to run some basic tests to rule out any physical causes," Dr. Johnson continued, his tone reassuring but clinical. "Sometimes vitamin deficiencies, thyroid problems, or other medical issues can cause symptoms that mimic psychological conditions. But based on what you're describing, and given the timing and stressors in your life, I think we should also consider the possibility that you're experiencing an anxiety-related disorder." The blood tests were scheduled for Thursday, giving me 2 more days to wonder whether my problems had a simple medical solution or represented something more complex and challenging to treat. In the meantime, Dr. Johnson recommended that I begin keeping a detailed journal of my symptoms, noting times, circumstances, and potential triggers for episodes of confusion or memory problems. "Documentation will help us identify patterns," he explained, handing me a small notebook designed specifically for tracking medical symptoms. "Often patients discover connections they hadn't noticed before when they start writing everything down systematically." The journal quickly became both a helpful tool and a source of additional anxiety. I documented every moment of confusion, every forgotten detail, every instance where my perceptions seemed unreliable. Within 3 days, I had filled 12 pages, with meticulous entries that painted a picture of someone whose mental faculties were deteriorating at an alarming rate. Tuesday morning, I forgot to turn off the coffee maker, discovering it still heating an empty pot when I returned from work. Tuesday afternoon, I couldn't remember whether I'd locked the front door, requiring a return trip from my car to verify. Tuesday evening, I lost 20 minutes looking for reading glasses that were sitting on top of my head the entire time. Each incident felt like further evidence that something was seriously wrong with my cognitive function. Michael read the journal, entries each evening, his expression growing more concerned as the documented problems accumulated. "This is really helpful information for Dr. Johnson," he'd say, though his tone suggested he was more worried than encouraged by the detailed record of my mental lapses. "At least, now we'll have concrete examples to discuss." The blood test results came back normal, eliminating the possibility that my symptoms had a simple medical explanation. Dr. Johnson called personally to discuss the findings, his voice carrying the slightly disappointed tone of someone who had hoped for an easy answer. "Everything looks excellent from a physical standpoint," he reported. "Your vitamin levels are perfect, thyroid function is normal, and all other indicators suggest you're in outstanding health. This means we need to consider psychological factors more seriously." The recommendation for a psychiatric evaluation felt like crossing a threshold I hadn't been prepared to approach. Dr. Johnson assured me that mental health treatment had become much more sophisticated and effective in recent years, that seeking help for anxiety or stress-related disorders was as routine as treating any other medical condition. Michael echoed these reassurances, emphasizing that psychological support would probably resolve my problems quickly and completely. Dr. Sarah Martinez at Sunset Medical Group specializes in anxiety disorders and stress-related cognitive issues, Dr. Johnson explained. She's excellent with high-functioning individuals who are experiencing temporary difficulties. I think she'd be perfect for your situation. The appointment was scheduled for the following week, giving me time to research Dr. Martinez's credentials and prepare for what felt like the most important conversation of my life. Her website described her specialization in treating professionals experiencing work-related stress, anxiety disorders that developed in high-pressure environments, and cognitive issues related to perfectionism and overachievement. The description seemed to match my situation perfectly, offering hope that my problems were both understandable and treatable. During the days leading up to the psychiatric appointment, my relationship with Michael deepened in ways I hadn't expected. Our conversations became more intimate and honest as I shared fears about my mental health that I'd never voiced before. He listened with patience and understanding that made me feel incredibly fortunate to have chosen such a supportive partner. "I'm scared that I'm becoming someone you didn't sign up to marry," I confessed one evening as we sat on our back porch watching the sunset. "This isn't what you expected when we said our vows." Michael's response was everything I needed to hear. "Emma, I married you for better or worse, in sickness and in health," he said, taking my hand in his with gentle firmness. "This is just a rough patch that we'll get through together. You're still the same brilliant, beautiful woman I fell in love with. You're just dealing with some temporary challenges that can be fixed." His confidence in our future felt like a gift during a period when I couldn't trust my own perceptions about anything. If Michael believed I would recover completely, then perhaps my fears about permanent mental decline were just another symptom of the anxiety disorder that was probably causing all my problems. The night before my appointment with Dr. Martinez, I experienced the worst episode yet. I woke up at 3 a.m, convinced that someone was in our house, hearing footsteps in the hallway and voices in the kitchen. The sounds were distinct, enough that I shook Michael awake, whispering urgently about the intruders who were apparently rifling through our belongings downstairs. Michael listened carefully, then got up to investigate while I remained in bed with my heart pounding and my phone ready to call 911. He was gone for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, returning to report that all doors and windows were secure, no signs of disturbance anywhere in the house, and no indication that anyone had been inside. "You must have been having a very vivid dream," he said gently, settling back into bed with the calm of someone who hadn't just searched an entire house for imaginary criminals. Sometimes anxiety can cause sleep disturbances that feel completely real. The incident was deeply unsettling because the sounds had seemed so genuine, so clearly audible that I remained convinced someone had been in our house, despite all evidence to the contrary. If my own senses couldn't be trusted to distinguish between reality and imagination, then my problems were more serious than I'd realized. I arrived at Dr. Martinez's office the next morning feeling like someone who desperately needed professional intervention. The waiting room was decorated in soothing blues and greens, with comfortable furniture and artwork that suggested healing and renewal. Unlike Dr. Johnson's medical office, this space felt designed to promote emotional well-being rather than diagnose physical ailments. Dr. Martinez herself was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a warm smile that immediately put me at ease. She invited me into her consultation room, which felt more like a comfortable living room than a clinical environment. 2 chairs faced each other across a small table, with soft lighting and plants that created an atmosphere conducive to honest conversation. "Tell me what brings you here today," she began, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to helping people navigate difficult emotional terrain. Unlike Dr. Johnson's medical approach, her questions focused on feelings, relationships, and the emotional context surrounding my symptoms. I found myself describing not just the memory problems and confusion, but the fear and shame that accompanied them. The embarrassment of forgetting familiar names at social gatherings, the anxiety about making mistakes at work that might affect my students' education, the growing sense that I was becoming a burden to Michael despite his patient support. "It sounds like you're dealing with a lot of pressure to maintain perfect performance in all areas of your life," Dr. Martinez observed. "That kind of sustained stress can definitely manifest in cognitive symptoms, especially for someone who's used to being highly competent and in control." Her assessment felt both validating and concerning. Validating because it suggested my problems had understandable causes and potentially effective treatments. Concerning because it confirmed that my mental state was indeed problematic enough to require professional intervention. "I'd like to schedule several more sessions so we can explore these issues more thoroughly," she continued. "I also think it might be helpful to do some cognitive testing to get a baseline assessment of your current functioning. Sometimes having objective data can be reassuring for people who are worried about their mental capabilities." The cognitive testing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, giving me time to continue documenting symptoms and working on stress reduction techniques that Dr. Martinez recommended. Simple meditation exercises, improved sleep hygiene, and boundaries around work responsibilities that might help reduce the psychological pressure I was apparently placing on myself. Michael was thrilled with the treatment plan, expressing optimism about my prognosis that exceeded even my own hopes for recovery. "Dr. Martinez sounds perfect for your situation," he said as we discussed the appointment over dinner. "And cognitive testing will probably show that your abilities are much better than you think they are. You've always been incredibly sharp, Emma. A little stress isn't going to change that fundamentally." His confidence was infectious, and for the first time in months, I began to believe that my problems might be temporary rather than progressive. If anxiety was the root cause of my symptoms, then anxiety could be treated with therapy, medication, and lifestyle changes that would restore my previous level of functioning. What I didn't realize was that Michael's enthusiasm about my psychiatric treatment had nothing to do with helping me recover. Every appointment I attended, every symptom I documented, every moment of confusion I experienced was actually building a case that he would eventually use to destroy my credibility completely. The man who held my hand through medical consultations and encouraged me to seek professional help was simultaneously constructing an elaborate narrative about my mental instability that would serve his purposes perfectly when the time came to deploy it. But I was still weeks away from discovering the truth about Michael's real agenda, and in the meantime, I was about to learn that my problems were far more complex than simple stress or anxiety could explain. The cognitive testing that I approached with nervous optimism would reveal information that contradicted everything everyone believed about my mental state, setting the stage for discoveries that would change my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my health, and the man I trusted most in the world. The cognitive testing appointment arrived on a crisp October morning that should have felt promising, but instead carried an undercurrent of dread I couldn't quite shake. I'd spent the previous 2 weeks diligently following Dr. Martinez's recommendations, practicing meditation techniques and maintaining detailed symptom logs that had become a second full-time job. The journal entries painted an increasingly complex picture of my mental state, documenting incidents that ranged from minor forgetfulness to episodes that genuinely frightened me. 3 nights earlier, I'd discovered all the books in my home, office rearranged in perfect alphabetical order, a task that would have taken hours to complete. I had no memory of organizing them, no recollection of even entering that room the previous evening. Michael found me standing in the doorway at midnight, staring at the impossibly neat shelves with tears streaming down my face. "I think I'm getting worse," I whispered, my voice barely audible even in the silence of our sleeping house. "I don't remember doing this, but who else could have? We've been home together all evening." Michael's arms wrapped around me from behind, his warmth both comforting and somehow distant. "Maybe you organized them during one of your stress episodes," he suggested gently. "Sometimes people do things automatically when they're anxious, without really registering the activity consciously." His explanation made logical sense, but the idea that I could spend hours on a complex task without any awareness terrified me more than simple forgetfulness ever had. If I could reorganize an entire library without conscious memory, what else might I be doing during these apparent dissociative episodes? The possibility that I was losing larger chunks of time felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss I couldn't fathom. The testing facility at Sunset Medical Group occupied an entire wing dedicated to psychological assessment and neurological evaluation. The waiting area was decorated with abstract artwork in muted colors, designed to be calming but somehow achieving the opposite effect. Other patients sat quietly with forms and clipboards, each absorbed in their own private struggles with cognition, memory, or emotional regulation. Dr. Martinez introduced me to Dr. Kevin Thompson, a neuropsychologist who specialized in cognitive assessment for adults experiencing unexplained mental symptoms. His office was filled with testing materials, computer monitors, and equipment that looked more scientific than anything I'd encountered in previous medical appointments. "We're going to spend about 4 hours together today," Dr. Thompson explained, his manner professional but reassuring. "I'll be evaluating various aspects of your cognitive function, including memory, attention, problem-solving abilities, and processing speed. The goal is to get an objective picture of how your mind is working right now." The first hour involved computerized tests that measured reaction time, pattern recognition, and sustained attention. I sat in front of a monitor clicking responses to stimuli that appeared and disappeared with scientific precision. Some tasks felt manageable, while others revealed deficits that aligned perfectly with my recent struggles. My attention wandered during longer sequences, and I found myself second-guessing responses that should have been automatic. Memory testing proved particularly challenging and emotionally exhausting. Dr. Thompson read lists of words, showed me sequences of images, and asked me to recall information after various time delays. Some material I retained perfectly, while other details vanished from my consciousness as if they'd never existed. The inconsistency was maddening, highlighting the unpredictable nature of whatever was affecting my cognitive function. "Can you tell me what you had for breakfast this morning?" Dr. Thompson asked during one section focused on recent memory. I paused, genuinely unable to recall the specific details of my morning routine. "I think it was cereal," I said uncertainly, "but I'm not completely sure. Maybe toast?" "Michael usually makes coffee, but I can't remember if I actually ate anything." The fact that I couldn't reliably remember events from just 4 hours earlier felt like confirmation of my worst fears about my deteriorating mental state. Dr. Thompson made notes without commentary, maintaining the neutral professionalism necessary for objective assessment, but I could see concern flickering in his expression. Problem-solving tasks revealed similar inconsistencies in my cognitive performance. Simple logical puzzles that should have been trivial for someone with my educational background sometimes stumped me completely, while more complex challenges occasionally clicked into place with surprising ease. The pattern made no sense, suggesting that my difficulties weren't following the typical progression of any recognized cognitive disorder. During a break between testing sections, I called Michael to update him on the morning's progress. His voice carried the careful concern I'd grown accustomed to, mixed with what sounded like genuine anxiety about the results. "How do you think it's going?" he asked, and I could hear traffic in the background suggesting he was driving between real estate appointments. Honestly, not great, I admitted, my voice catching slightly as I spoke. There are definitely problems with my memory and attention that weren't there before. Dr. Thompson isn't saying much, but I can tell he's seeing the same issues that have been worrying us. Remember that this is just one data point, Michael said, his tone shifting into the encouraging register he used when I was particularly discouraged. Even if there are some challenges now, that doesn't mean they're permanent. Dr. Martinez already explained that stress-related cognitive problems are usually completely reversible with proper treatment. His optimism felt both supportive and slightly disconnected from the reality of what I was experiencing during the assessment. The problems weren't subtle or marginal, they were significant enough that a trained professional was documenting them systematically. But Michael's confidence in my eventual recovery had become one of my few sources of hope during this frightening period. The afternoon testing sessions focused on more complex cognitive functions, including executive planning, abstract reasoning, and emotional regulation. These evaluations felt less like medical tests and more like academic examinations that I was failing despite years of educational success. I'm going to describe a scenario, and I want you to walk me through how you would handle it, Dr. Thompson explained, presenting what should have been a straightforward problem-solving exercise. You're planning a dinner party for 8 people. 1 guest is vegetarian, 2 have food allergies, and you have a limited budget. How would you approach the menu planning? The question should have been simple for someone who had organized countless social gatherings and managed complex logistics as part of my teaching responsibilities. Instead, I found myself struggling to hold all the variables in my mind simultaneously, losing track of constraints and requirements as I tried to formulate a coherent response. I would start by, I began, then paused as the details became muddled in my thoughts. Actually, could you repeat the allergies? I'm having trouble keeping track of all the requirements. Dr. Thompson repeated the scenario patiently, and I attempted the exercise again with similar results. My thinking felt fragmented, lacking the organizational clarity that had always been one of my strongest cognitive assets. The realization that I couldn't reliably manage the mental complexity of planning a simple dinner party was devastating. For someone whose profession required orchestrating the educational needs of dozens of students daily, emotional regulation testing proved equally concerning, revealing heightened anxiety responses and difficulty managing stress reactions that hadn't been characteristic of my personality previously. Tasks that induced mild frustration triggered disproportionate emotional responses, suggesting that my psychological coping mechanisms had been significantly compromised. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your current stress level? Dr. Thompson asked during one particularly challenging sequence. 8 or 9, I replied honestly, aware that my hands were trembling slightly and my heart rate had increased noticeably. But this would normally be maybe a 4 or 5 for me. I used to handle pressure much better than this. The contrast between my historical emotional resilience and current hypersensitivity felt like evidence of fundamental changes in my psychological makeup. I'd always been someone who thrived under pressure, who could manage multiple demanding responsibilities, while maintaining composure and clarity. The person struggling through these assessments felt like a damaged version of my former self. By the end of the 4-hour evaluation, I was emotionally exhausted and intellectually drained in ways that normal activities hadn't affected me for months. Dr. Thompson explained that results would be compiled and analyzed over the following week, with a comprehensive report sent to Dr. Martinez for discussion during our next therapy session. "What's your preliminary impression?" I asked, needing some immediate feedback, despite knowing that official results would require more thorough analysis. Dr. Thompson's response was carefully measured, professional, but not entirely reassuring. "I can see that you're experiencing some legitimate cognitive challenges that align with your reported symptoms," he said. The good news is that your baseline intellectual functioning remains strong in many areas. The concerning news is that there are definite attention and memory deficits that warrant further investigation. His assessment confirmed my fears while offering limited hope for improvement. The phrase "warrant further investigation" suggested that my problems might be more complex than simple stress-related difficulties, potentially requiring more intensive treatment or revealing underlying conditions that hadn't been previously identified. Michael met me in the parking lot after the testing session, having rearranged his afternoon schedule to provide support during what we both knew would be an emotionally challenging day. His presence felt like a lifeline after hours of confronting evidence of my cognitive decline in a clinical setting. "How was it?" he asked, studying my face with the careful attention he'd developed for reading my emotional state during difficult periods. "Honestly terrible," I replied, settling into the passenger seat with relief at no longer being responsible for complex mental tasks. "There are definitely problems, Michael. Real problems that showed up clearly during the testing. I'm not imagining this or overreacting to normal stress." The drive home was quiet except for occasional reassurances from Michael about the temporary nature of my difficulties and the effectiveness of treatments for cognitive issues related to anxiety disorders. His confidence felt increasingly important, as my own faith in recovery began to waver under the weight of objective evidence about my mental state. That evening, I attempted to grade student essays, but found myself unable to maintain focus for more than a few minutes at a time. Simple grammatical errors that I would normally catch automatically seemed to blur past my attention, while complex analysis that had always been my strength felt overwhelming and unmanageable. After an hour of minimal progress, I closed the laptop in frustration and joined Michael on the couch, where he was watching a basketball game with the relaxed attention of someone whose mind functioned reliably. "I don't think I can keep teaching like this," I said, the words emerging before I'd fully processed the thought. "If I can't focus enough to grade papers properly, how can I be responsible for students' education?" Michael muted the television and turned to face me with the serious expression he wore when addressing my most significant concerns. "Don't make any major decisions while you're in the middle of this episode," he advised gently. "Once we get your anxiety under control and your cognitive function stabilizes, you'll probably feel completely different about your teaching abilities." His suggestion to avoid major decisions felt both prudent and terrifying, implying that my current judgment couldn't be trusted even about fundamental life choices. The idea that I might need to take extended medical leave from a job I loved added another layer of loss to an already overwhelming situation. The week waiting for test results passed with agonizing slowness, filled with continued documentation of cognitive incidents and growing anxiety about the official assessment of my mental capabilities. I found myself alternating between hope that the results would reveal a treatable condition and fear that they would confirm irreversible damage to my intellectual functioning. Dr. Martinez's office felt different when I returned for the results. Consultation, somehow smaller and more clinical despite the same comfortable furniture and soothing artwork. She spread the neuropsychological report across the small table between us, her expression serious but not entirely discouraging. "The testing confirms that you're experiencing some genuine cognitive challenges," she began, her voice carrying the careful tone medical professionals use when delivering difficult news. "Your attention and short-term memory show significant deficits compared to what we would expect for someone with your educational background and intellectual capacity." The phrase "significant deficits" hit me like a physical blow, confirming my worst fears about the extent of my mental deterioration. "Doctor," Martinez continued with more technical details about specific test scores and comparative analysis, but the core message was clear. My cognitive function had declined measurably from what should have been my baseline performance. However, she continued, and I grasped at that word like a drowning person reaching for a lifeline. The pattern of deficits is somewhat unusual for typical anxiety disorders or stress-related cognitive issues. Dr. Thompson noted some inconsistencies that might warrant additional investigation. The suggestion of further testing felt overwhelming after the exhausting evaluation I'd already endured. But Dr. Martinez explained that additional assessments might help identify more specific causes for my symptoms and potentially more targeted treatments. What kind of additional investigation? I asked, though part of me dreaded learning about more complex medical procedures or psychological evaluations. Possibly some medical imaging to rule out neurological causes, and perhaps consultation with a specialist in cognitive disorders, she replied. Sometimes conditions that initially appear psychological have underlying medical components that respond well to specific treatments. The appointment ended with referrals to additional specialists and recommendations for continued therapy, while we pursued more comprehensive evaluation of my condition. Dr. Martinez assured me that cognitive problems were often highly treatable, once properly diagnosed, but her optimism felt tempered by genuine concern about the complexity of my situation. Michael was waiting in the car outside the medical building, having spent the appointment time at a nearby coffee shop to give me privacy for the consultation. His immediate attention to my emotional state when I emerged from the building felt both comforting and slightly overwhelming. "What did she say?" he asked, pulling away from the parking lot while I buckled my seatbelt with hands that still trembled slightly from anxiety. "The testing confirmed problems," I reported, my voice flat with exhaustion and disappointment. "Significant deficits in attention and memory that aren't typical for someone my age and background. She wants more testing to figure out what's causing archeo." Michael's response surprised me with its immediate intensity. "More testing? Emma, you've already been through so much evaluation. Maybe we should focus on treatment rather than endless diagnostic procedures." His suggestion felt both protective and slightly concerning, as if he were more worried about the stress of additional testing than curious about potential underlying causes for my symptoms. But his concern for my well-being had been consistent throughout this ordeal, and I trusted his judgment about what might be best for my recovery. "Dr. Martinez thinks there might be medical causes that could respond to specific treatments," I explained, though his reluctance about further evaluation made me question whether additional testing was worth the emotional and financial cost. "I just want you to get better," he said, reaching across to squeeze my hand while navigating traffic. "Whatever it takes, we'll figure this out together." That night, lying in bed beside my sleeping husband, I stared at the ceiling and tried to process the reality of my diagnosed cognitive impairment. The official confirmation felt both validating and terrifying, proving that my struggles weren't imaginary while simultaneously confirming that my mental capabilities had genuinely deteriorated in measurable ways. What I didn't know, as I finally drifted off to sleep clutching the medical reports that documented my intellectual decline, was that those same reports contained information that would eventually expose the most sophisticated gaslighting campaign I could have ever imagined. The cognitive testing that seemed to confirm my mental instability would ultimately become the key to proving my sanity and revealing the elaborate deception that had been orchestrated against me by the person I trusted most in the world. The discovery happened completely by accident, the way life-altering revelations often do. I was looking for aspirin in Michael's desk drawer, suffering from another stress headache that had become my daily companion, when my fingers brushed against something unexpected tucked behind a stack of real estate contracts. The small orange prescription bottle felt foreign in my hands, especially since Michael had always prided himself on avoiding medications of any kind. The label made my blood freeze in my veins. Lorazepam, prescribed to Rachel Torres with instructions for anxiety and sleep disorders. Rachel Torres, whose name I recognized as Michael's new marketing coordinator at the real estate office, the woman he'd mentioned casually in passing, describing her as efficient and dedicated, someone who was helping modernize their client outreach strategies. I stood in our home office holding evidence of a connection I couldn't immediately understand, my mind racing through possible explanations that didn't involve the devastating possibility that was already forming in my consciousness. Maybe Rachel had left the medication at the office and Michael had offered to return it. Maybe it was some kind of professional favor, helping a colleague who was too embarrassed to handle her own prescription pickup. But even as I constructed these innocent explanations, a deeper intuition was awakening, connecting dots that I'd been too trusting to notice before. The late nights at the office, the weekend appointments that seemed to multiply whenever I was having particularly difficult episodes, the way Michael's phone buzzed constantly with text messages he claimed were work-related emergencies. The sound of his car in the driveway sent a jolt of panic through my system. I quickly returned the medication to its hiding place, arranging the papers exactly as I'd found them, though my hands shook so violently that I knocked over a pen holder in the process. The rattling sound seemed deafeningly loud in the silence of our house, but Michael's footsteps on the front porch suggested he hadn't noticed the disturbance. "How was your afternoon?" he asked, entering the house with the relaxed demeanor of someone returning from legitimate business activities. His smile was warm and genuine, the same expression that had comforted me through months of psychological crisis, but now it felt like looking at a stranger wearing my husband's face. "Fine," I managed, my voice sounding strangely distant even to my own ears. "Just grading papers and trying to manage this headache." Michael's immediate concern felt both familiar and newly suspicious. The articles were convincing, filled with clinical descriptions that matched my symptoms perfectly. Sleep disturbances, memory gaps, paranoid thoughts about being watched or followed, difficulty concentrating on familiar tasks. Michael would read these passages aloud, his finger tracing the words as if he were a doctor delivering a diagnosis. "See? It says right here that high-functioning individuals often experience these symptoms when they're pushing themselves too hard," he'd explain, his arm tightening around my shoulders in what felt like protective comfort. "You're not crazy, Emma. You're just human, and you need some professional support to get through this rough patch." Our social life began revolving around my apparent mental health struggles. Michael would explain my absences from dinner parties and family gatherings with concerned whispers about my condition. I'd overhear him on the phone with his brother James, speaking in hushed tones about his worry for my well-being. "She's been having such a hard time lately," he'd say, his voice carrying the exhausted patience of a devoted husband dealing with a troubled wife. I'm trying to be supportive, but sometimes I don't know how to help her. She gets so confused about simple things, and then she gets upset when I try to correct the misunderstandings. These conversations made me feel simultaneously grateful for his loyalty and ashamed of the burden I was apparently placing on our marriage. Michael never complained directly to me about the extra stress my condition was causing, but I could see the toll in his tired eyes and increasingly frequent business trips. He was working longer hours, staying late at the real estate office, taking weekend appointments that kept him away from home for entire days. "I'm so sorry you're dealing with this," I'd tell him when he'd return from these extended work sessions, his clothes wrinkled and his expression strained. "I know this can't be easy for you." "Don't apologize," he'd reply, pulling me into embraces that felt both comforting and distant. "You can't help what you're going through. I just want you to get better for both of us." His words were exactly what a loving husband should say, but something about his delivery felt rehearsed, like lines he'd practiced for an audience I couldn't see. The breaking point came during a family barbecue at Patricia's house, surrounded by Michael's relatives who had known me since our engagement. I'd been looking forward to the gathering, hoping that a normal social event might help me feel more like my old self. Instead, it became a public demonstration of my apparent mental deterioration. I arrived at Patricia's house carrying a homemade potato salad, proud that I'd managed to complete a recipe without any major disasters. The backyard was filled with the familiar faces of Michael's extended family, people who had welcomed me warmly for years and treated me like a beloved daughter and sister-in-law. Within an hour, Everything had gone wrong in ways that seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears about my mental state. First, I couldn't remember James's wife's name, even though I'd known Lisa for 3 years and had attended her birthday party just 2 months earlier. I stood there stumbling over words, calling her Linda, then Laura, while she smiled with the kind of forced patience people reserve for elderly relatives with dementia. "It's Lisa," she said gently, touching my arm with what felt like pity. "Are you feeling all right, Emma? You look a little pale." Then I forgot where I'd parked the car, wandering the neighborhood for 20 minutes while Michael and his family helped search. When we finally found it 3 blocks away, I had no memory of parking it there, no recollection of walking back to the house from such a distance. The confusion was genuine and terrifying, but Michael's explanation to his family felt like a public diagnosis. "She's been having some memory issues lately," he told them, his voice carrying the weary concern of someone dealing with a chronic problem. "We're working with her doctor to figure out what's causing it, but it's been really challenging for both of us." The worst incident happened when I accused Tom Wilson, their neighbor, of moving my purse from the patio table to a chair inside the house. I was certain I'd left it outside next to my drink, but when I went to retrieve it, the purse was sitting on Patricia's kitchen counter next to a plate of cookies. "I didn't touch your purse, Emma," Tom said, his expression mixing confusion with growing alarm. "I've been in the backyard the whole time, grilling with Michael." His wife nodded in agreement, both of them looking at me with the kind of concern usually reserved for people experiencing medical emergencies. Michael appeared beside me with what seemed like perfect timing, his hand finding my elbow in a gesture that looked supportive but felt controlling. "Let's get you some water, honey," he said, guiding me away from the small crowd that had gathered to witness my breakdown. "You're probably just dehydrated. It's been such a hot day." But the damage was done. I could see the looks passing between family members, the whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. The careful way people began speaking to me as if I were made of glass and might shatter at any moment. "Michael's been such a saint," I heard Patricia whisper to her sister as I pretended to examine the flowers near the patio door. "I don't know how he handles it all. Poor Emma seems to be getting worse, and he's trying so hard to be supportive, while managing his business and everything else." The drive home was silent, except for the air conditioning and Michael's occasional sighs. I stared out the window at the familiar streets of our neighborhood, feeling like a stranger in my own life. Nothing made sense anymore. "Another headache? You've been getting so many lately. Maybe we should talk to Dr. Johnson about stronger pain medication." The offer of additional medication struck me as particularly ironic given what I'd just discovered hidden in his desk. How many pills had been introduced into my daily routine without my knowledge? How many of my symptoms might be artificially induced rather than naturally occurring? That evening, I found myself studying Michael with the intensity of someone seeing him clearly for the first time. His expressions, his timing, his responses to my symptoms all felt different when viewed through the lens of potential deception. The loving husband who had been my anchor during psychological turmoil suddenly seemed like an actor playing a role, and I was terrified to discover what might be happening behind the performance. Sleep became impossible as my mind raced through months of incidents that took on new meaning when considered as potential sabotage rather than natural deterioration. The misplaced items, the forgotten appointments, the mysterious rearrangement of my office books all could be explained by someone with unlimited access to my home and detailed knowledge of my routines. The next morning brought a text message. That changed everything. Michael's phone buzzed during breakfast, and he reached for it with the automatic response I'd grown accustomed to during recent months. But this time, the phone was angled in a way that allowed me to glimpse the sender's name and the beginning of the message. Rachel Torres. "Last night was incredible. Can't wait for tonight when she's at her therapy appointment." The words hit me like physical blows, each phrase confirming my worst fears while simultaneously revealing the scope of deception I'd been living with for months. Michael's affair wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage. It was being conducted with careful planning around my medical appointments, using my psychological treatment schedule as a cover for his relationship with another woman. Michael's fingers moved quickly to delete the message, but not before I'd read enough to understand that my therapy sessions weren't providing healing for my damaged mind. They were providing opportunities for my husband to destroy our marriage while I sought help for problems he was actively creating. "Work emergency," he said, glancing up from his phone with the practiced casualness of someone accustomed to lying. "Rachel's having trouble with the client database. I might need to go in early to help her sort it out." The ease with which he constructed the deception was perhaps more shocking than the affair itself. He looked directly into my eyes while crafting a story about professional assistance, his expression carrying the same concerned attention he'd shown throughout my psychological crisis. How many lies had I believed while trusting his fundamental honesty? "Of course," I replied, my voice somehow remaining steady despite the earthquake occurring inside my chest. "You should help her with whatever she needs." The double meaning in my words felt like a small act of rebellion, a hint that I was beginning to understand the game being played around me. Michael's smile in response felt like confirmation that he had no idea his careful deception was beginning to unravel. After Michael left for his emergency assistance with Rachel's database problems, I sat in our kitchen drinking coffee that tasted like ash and trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. The man I'd trusted with my deepest fears about my mental health was simultaneously creating those fears and using them as cover for adultery. Every symptom I'd experienced, every moment of confusion and self-doubt, had been orchestrated by someone who slept beside me every night and held my hand during medical appointments. The psychological violation felt more devastating than simple infidelity. Michael hadn't just broken our marriage vows. He'd systematically attacked my sanity, my professional reputation, and my fundamental ability to trust my own perceptions. The cruelty was so elaborate and sustained that it took my breath away. But alongside the horror came something unexpected: clarity. For the first time in months, my thinking felt sharp and focused, no longer clouded by self-doubt about my own mental capabilities. The cognitive problems that had driven me to seek psychiatric help weren't symptoms of psychological disorder. They were evidence of psychological warfare being conducted by someone who had intimate access to my daily life. I spent the morning systematically searching our house for additional evidence of Michael's deception, moving through rooms with the methodical attention of a detective investigating a crime scene. In his bathroom cabinet, I found sleep aids. That didn't belong to either of us. In his car, I discovered receipts for restaurants we'd never visited together, dating back months and always for two people. The most damning evidence came from his laptop, which he'd left open in his hurry to respond to Rachel's urgent text message. His email account contained months of correspondence with Rachel that painted a picture of an affair that had been developing since shortly after my symptoms began. But more shocking than the romantic messages were the discussions about my psychological state and their plans for managing my treatment. "She's getting more suspicious," Michael had written in an email dated just 2 weeks earlier. The cognitive testing results were perfect for establishing her instability. "But we need to be more careful about timing. Maybe you should stay away from the office when she might stop by unexpectedly." Rachel's response revealed the calculated nature of their deception. "Don't worry so much. Everyone at work already thinks she's having a breakdown. Dr. Martinez told my sister that Emma's case is particularly challenging because the anxiety is affecting her perception of reality. No one's going to believe her if she starts making accusations." The casual way they discussed my psychological destruction while planning their romantic encounters felt like reading about war crimes being committed against my own consciousness. These weren't impulsive people caught up in passion. They were conspirators deliberately destroying my mental health for their own convenience. But the most revelatory discovery came in an email thread between Michael and someone identified only as D in his contacts. The messages revealed sophisticated planning around my medication and environmental manipulation that explained every mysterious incident I'd experienced over the past months. The book reorganization worked perfectly, Michael had written. She spent 2 hours staring at the shelves, completely convinced she'd done it herself during some kind of dissociative episode. Dr. Martinez says these kinds of incidents are building a strong case for her unreliability. The response from Dee was even more chilling. Good work with the lorazepam doses. Small amounts dissolved in her morning coffee are keeping her confused without causing obvious sedation. Just make sure you're documenting all the incidents for potential legal proceedings. Legal proceedings. The phrase suggested that Michael's psychological manipulation had goals beyond simply covering his affair. He was building a case against my mental competency that could be used in divorce proceedings, probably to minimize alimony payments or challenge my ability to claim marital assets. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its cruelty and sophistication. My husband, his mistress, and at least one other collaborator had been systematically drugging me, manipulating my environment, and documenting my confused responses as evidence of mental instability. Every medical appointment, every therapy session, every cognitive test had been part of an elaborate scheme to establish my psychological unreliability. But they had made one crucial mistake in their careful planning. By encouraging me to seek extensive medical documentation of my condition, they had created a detailed record of my baseline mental state and the timeline of my symptoms. The very evidence they thought supported their narrative of my instability would actually prove their guilt once the truth about the drugging came to light. I photographed every relevant email and document, uploading the evidence to a secure cloud storage account that Michael didn't know existed. The process felt like gathering ammunition for a war I hadn't known I was fighting, but I was determined to be prepared for whatever legal and social battles lay ahead. The hardest part was maintaining normal behavior when Michael returned from his emergency office visit, his clothes slightly wrinkled and his expression carrying the satisfied relaxation of someone who had enjoyed an afternoon with his lover. He asked about my day with the same attentive concern he'd shown throughout my psychological crisis, apparently unaware that I now knew exactly what he'd been doing while I struggled with symptoms he was deliberately creating. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling onto the couch beside me with the comfortable intimacy of our established evening routine. "Any more confusion or memory problems today?" The question felt like a taunt disguised as caring inquiry. "Actually, I'm feeling much clearer than I have in months," I replied truthfully, though I didn't explain that the clarity came from finally understanding the source of my previous confusion. Michael's expression flickered with something that might have been concern, but he quickly recovered with encouraging words about my apparent improvement. "That's wonderful news. Maybe the therapy is finally starting to help your anxiety levels." His ability to maintain the deception even when discussing my recovery was remarkable in its shamelessness. He was simultaneously celebrating my improved mental state and probably planning additional sabotage to ensure my continued instability. The psychological sophistication required for such sustained manipulation suggested that Michael was far more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. That night, I lay awake beside my sleeping husband, listening to his peaceful breathing while planning my response to months of psychological torture. The evidence I'd gathered was comprehensive enough to expose their conspiracy, but I needed to be strategic about timing and presentation to ensure maximum impact. The annual charity fundraiser at Golden Oak Country Club was scheduled for the following weekend, an event that would bring together everyone who had witnessed my apparent psychological decline over the past months. Michael's colleagues, our mutual friends, medical professionals from the community, and family members who had expressed concern about my mental health would all be present. It would be the perfect venue for revealing the truth about my husband's elaborate deception and demonstrating that the mentally unstable woman they'd all been pitying was actually the victim of a sophisticated psychological assault. The same social gathering that Michael probably expected to attend as the devoted husband of a troubled wife would become the stage for exposing him as the architect of her suffering, I began planning my revelation with the same methodical attention that Michael had used to destroy my sanity. Every detail needed to be perfect, every piece of evidence readily accessible, every potential response anticipated and prepared for. After months of being the victim of psychological warfare, I was finally ready to fight back with weapons my enemies hadn't seen coming. The medical records that Michael had encouraged me to compile, the documentation he thought supported his narrative of my instability, would become proof of the timeline and methods of his sabotage. The cognitive testing results that seemed to confirm my mental deterioration would actually demonstrate the effects of sustained drugging on an otherwise healthy mind. Most importantly, the extensive psychiatric evaluation that Dr. Martinez had conducted would provide baseline evidence of my actual psychological state, contradicting months of manipulated symptoms and proving that my fundamental mental capabilities remained intact despite the chemical and environmental assault I'd endured. Michael had spent months constructing an elaborate fiction about my mental health, never realizing that he was actually creating the very evidence that would expose his crimes and vindicate my sanity. The man who thought he was building a case against my reliability was about to discover that he had actually documented his own guilt in excruciating detail. The Golden Oak Country Club sparkled under crystal chandeliers and autumn decorations, transformed into an elegant venue for the annual charity fundraiser that drew Riverside's most prominent citizens. Women in designer gowns mingled with men in tailored suits, everyone participating in the carefully choreographed social ritual that defined our community's elite gatherings. The evening represented everything Michael valued about our social standing, which made it the perfect setting for destroying the reputation he'd worked so hard to build. I arrived wearing the navy blue dress Michael had always complimented, my hair styled in the elegant updo he preferred for formal events. To every observer, I appeared to be the devoted wife accompanying her successful husband to an important social obligation. No one could have guessed that I was carrying enough evidence in my small evening purse to detonate every relationship in the room. The weight of the folder felt substantial against my hip, a physical reminder of the ammunition I'd spent days preparing. Each document had been carefully selected for maximum impact, arranged in a sequence that would tell the story of my systematic psychological destruction in undeniable terms. The medical records that Michael had encouraged me to compile, believing they supported his narrative of my mental instability, would instead prove the deliberate nature of my symptoms and expose the sophisticated campaign he'd waged against my sanity. Michael's behavior throughout the cocktail hour confirmed everything I'd learned about his character over the past week. He worked the room with practiced charm, introducing me to clients and colleagues with the protective tenderness of a devoted husband, managing his wife's delicate mental health. His performance was flawless, hitting every note of concern, patience, and loyalty that would make observers admire his dedication to our marriage despite my obvious psychological struggles. "Emma's been going through a challenging period," I heard him explain to Patricia Williams, the bank president's wife, his voice carrying just the right blend of worry and discretion. "We're working with some excellent doctors, and I'm confident she'll make a full recovery. She's incredibly strong, even when she doesn't feel that way herself." Patricia's response was exactly what Michael had been cultivating for months. "You're such a devoted husband, Michael. Emma is so fortunate to have someone who stands by her during difficult times. Not every man would be so patient and understanding." The praise he received for tolerating my supposed mental illness made my stomach turn, but it also demonstrated the effectiveness of his long-term strategy. Everyone at this gathering believed they were witnessing a tragic situation being handled with exceptional grace by a husband who deserved admiration for his loyalty. They had no idea they were actually observing the aftermath of sustained psychological torture conducted by the very man they were praising. Standing near the silent auction tables, I watched Michael accept condolences and encouragement from people who genuinely believed they were supporting a man through his wife's mental health crisis. Their sympathy was real, their concern authentic, their admiration for his devotion completely sincere. The disconnect between their perception and reality was staggering. highlighting just how effectively Michael had manipulated not just me, but our entire social circle. Dr. Susan Chen, our family dentist, approached with the kind of gentle concern reserved for delicate situations. "Michael, how is Emma doing these days? We've all been so worried about her. It must be incredibly difficult for both of you." Michael's response demonstrated the masterful way he'd learned to discuss my condition, providing enough detail to seem transparent while carefully controlling the narrative. "She has good days and bad days," he said, his hand finding my shoulder in what appeared to be a supportive gesture. "The doctors are optimistic about her prognosis, but it's been a long journey. Some days she's completely herself, and other days—" He trailed off with the practiced resignation of someone who'd accepted a difficult burden. "Other days, I'm much clearer than people expect," I interjected, my voice carrying a strength that made both Dr. Chen and Michael glance at me with surprise. "In fact, I've been having remarkable clarity lately about what's really been happening to me." The comment hung in the air for a moment that felt charged with possibility. Dr. Chen smiled encouragingly, probably interpreting my words as a positive sign of recovery. Michael's expression flickered with something that might have been concern, but he quickly covered it with an indulgent smile. "That's wonderful to hear, sweetheart," he said, though his tone carried a note of caution that suggested he was monitoring my behavior for signs of inappropriate disclosure. "Dr. Martinez has been saying that insight into one's condition is often a sign of improvement." The casual way he referenced my psychiatric treatment, as if it were a shared experience rather than something he'd orchestrated for his own purposes, was remarkable in its audacity. He spoke about my therapy sessions and medication trials as if he were a concerned partner, rather than the architect of the problems they were meant to address. Rachel Torres arrived fashionably late, wearing a red dress that complemented her dark hair and confident demeanor. She moved through the crowd with the poise of someone who belonged in these elevated social circles, accepting compliments on her appearance and engaging in sophisticated conversations about community initiatives and business developments. Watching her interact with people who considered me mentally unstable was particularly galling. She laughed at appropriate moments, expressed concern about local issues, and generally conducted herself like a respectable professional woman rather than someone who had spent months conspiring to destroy another woman's sanity. The disconnect between her public persona and her private actions was breathtaking in its audacity. I observed Rachel's careful navigation of the social landscape, noting how she managed to position herself near Michael without appearing to seek his attention. Specifically, their interactions were professionally appropriate, but carried an undercurrent of intimacy that would have been invisible to casual observers. They had perfected the art of conducting their affair in plain sight, using my supposed mental instability as cover for behavior that might otherwise have raised suspicions. The most revealing moment came when Rachel approached Michael and me near the silent auction displays, her smile bright with the confidence of someone who believed her secrets were perfectly safe. Her timing was impeccable, arriving during a lull in conversation when we appeared to be examining charity auction items rather than engaged in serious discussion. "Michael, Emma," she greeted us with warm professionalism that felt like watching a talented actress inhabit a role. "What a lovely event. I'm so glad I could attend this year." Her eyes met mine with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "Emma, you look wonderful tonight. I hope you're feeling better these days." The concern in her voice was so convincing that I almost doubted my own evidence of her involvement in my psychological torture. But the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for her wine glass betrayed the nervousness beneath her composed exterior. She knew exactly what she had done to me, and she was performing concern the same way Michael performed devoted husband. "I'm feeling much clearer lately," I replied, allowing a meaningful pause before adding, "It's amazing how much better things get once you understand what's really happening." Rachel's smile faltered almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that confirmed she understood the subtext of my comment. Her recovery was quick, but not before I caught the flash of genuine fear that crossed her features. The confident woman who had greeted us moments earlier was still there. But underneath, I could see someone calculating risks and possibly reconsidering her safety. Michael's hand found my elbow in what appeared to be a supportive gesture, but felt more like a warning, his fingers applying just enough pressure to suggest I should moderate my conversation. The touch was subtle enough that observers would interpret it as loving attention, but I could feel the controlling intent behind the gentle contact. "The auction items are particularly impressive this year," Michael said, smoothly redirecting the conversation away from my cryptic comments about clarity and understanding. "The vacation packages are generating quite a bit of interest." His skill at managing social situations was evident in the way he diffused potential tension while maintaining the appearance of normal conversation. But I noticed that he positioned himself between Rachel and me, creating a physical barrier that prevented further direct interaction while appearing to simply engage with the auction displays. Dr. Martinez appeared beside our small group, her presence adding an element I hadn't anticipated but welcomed enthusiastically. As my treating psychiatrist, her observations about my condition carried professional weight that would be crucial for what I planned to reveal. Her arrival felt like cosmic timing, providing exactly the credible witness I needed for maximum impact. "Emma, you do look remarkably well tonight," Dr. Martinez observed, her trained eye noting details that others might miss. "Your affect seems much more stable than during our recent sessions. Your posture is more confident, your speech patterns are clearer, and your eye contact is direct and sustained. Are you feeling as improved as you appear?" Her clinical assessment was more detailed than I'd expected, suggesting that she'd been monitoring my condition more carefully than I'd realized. The specific nature of her observations also indicated that my previous symptoms had been more obvious to professional evaluation than I'd understood at the time. The question provided an opening I couldn't have scripted better myself. "Dr. Martinez, I'm feeling more like myself than I have in months," I said, my voice carrying a strength that hadn't been present during my previous interactions with her. "In fact, I've made some discoveries recently that explain everything I've been experiencing." The word discoveries seemed to electrify the air around our small group. Dr. Martinez's professional curiosity was immediately engaged, while Michael's tension became palpable despite his continued attempt to maintain a supportive facade. Rachel had gone very still, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips as she processed the implications of my statement. Michael's response was swift and practiced, the same protective intervention he'd used countless times over the past months. When my conversation threatened to venture into territory he considered inappropriate. "Honey, maybe this isn't the best place to discuss medical issues," he suggested gently, his tone carrying the patient concern of someone managing a spouse's potentially embarrassing social behavior. The suggestion was perfectly reasonable on its surface, the kind of guidance a caring husband might offer to protect his wife from oversharing personal information in a social setting. But I could hear the desperation underneath his measured words. The fear of someone whose carefully constructed deception was beginning to unravel in the worst possible setting. "Actually, I think this is exactly the right place," I said, reaching into my purse to retrieve the folder I'd prepared with meticulous care. "Because everyone here has been so concerned about my mental health, I thought they'd want to know what was really causing my symptoms." The folder felt substantial in my hands, weighted with the power to transform everything these people believed about my marriage, my mental state, and the man they'd been admiring for his devotion. I'd spent hours organizing the contents for maximum impact, arranging documents in a sequence that would tell the story of my systematic destruction in a way that even skeptical observers couldn't dismiss. Dr. Martinez accepted the documents, with professional curiosity, her expression changing dramatically as she processed the information. Years of clinical experience had taught her to recognize the signs of authentic psychological distress versus artificially induced symptoms, and the evidence I'd compiled painted a clear picture of deliberate sabotage. The first document she examined was the laboratory report confirming the presence of lorazepam in my hair samples, dated and certified by an independent testing facility. Her eyebrows rose as she absorbed the implications of finding prescription anxiety medication in someone who had never been prescribed such drugs and who had consistently denied taking any substances that might affect her cognitive function. "This is quite remarkable," Dr. Martinez said, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose professional opinion carried significant weight in our community. "Emma, these documents suggest that your cognitive symptoms were artificially induced through systematic drugging and environmental manipulation." The words hung in the air like a bomb detonating in slow motion. Conversations around us gradually stopped as nearby guests caught fragments of Dr. Martinez's clinical assessment. The phrase systematic drugging was particularly powerful, carrying implications that went far beyond marital problems or even simple adultery. Michael's face went through a series of expressions, from confusion to concern to something approaching panic as he realized the magnitude of what was being revealed. His carefully maintained composure began cracking under the pressure of professional scrutiny, revealing glimpses of the calculating mind that had orchestrated months of psychological torture. "I don't understand," Michael said, his voice carrying a tremor I'd never heard before. "Emma, what are you talking about? What documents? This sounds like another paranoid episode." His attempt to maintain innocence was admirable, but ultimately futile. The word "another" was particularly damaging, suggesting a pattern of accusations that he'd been managing and dismissing over time. But Dr. Martinez was already shaking her head, her professional assessment contradicting his desperate attempt to reframe my revelations as symptoms of mental illness. Rachel had gone completely pale, her wineglass trembling in her hand as she processed the implications of my revelation. The confident woman who had greeted us moments earlier was rapidly being replaced by someone who looked like she was calculating escape routes and considering whether she could disappear before the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed. "Michael, I found the emails," I said simply, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet space around us. "I found the coordination with Rachel about timing your encounters around my therapy appointments. I found the discussions with your accomplice about dosing my coffee with anxiety medication. I found everything." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of music and conversation from other parts of the venue. People who had been engaged in their own social interactions were now openly staring at our group, sensing that they were witnessing something far more dramatic than typical charity event conversation. Dr. Martinez continued examining the documents, her professional training evident in the way she systematically reviewed each piece of evidence. She studied the email printouts with particular attention, noting dates, times, and specific references to my medical appointments and medication schedules. These communications referenced specific details about Emma's treatment that would only be known to someone with unauthorized access to confidential medical information, she observed, her voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone making an official clinical assessment. The level of detail about medication timing and therapeutic interventions suggests extensive planning and coordination. Her professional validation of the evidence was devastating to Michael's credibility. This wasn't just a wife making accusations against her husband. This was a respected psychiatrist confirming that systematic psychological abuse had occurred, supported by documented evidence that met clinical standards for reliability. Patricia Williams was the first to speak from the growing crowd of observers, her voice carrying the shocked outrage of someone whose worldview had just been fundamentally challenged. "Michael, is this true? Have you been deliberately making Emma sick?" The question forced Michael to abandon his pretense of confusion and shift into damage control mode. His response revealed the calculating nature that had been hidden beneath his devoted husband performance for months. "This is obviously another episode," he said, his voice gaining strength as he settled into a familiar narrative. "Emma's been having paranoid delusions about being drugged. It's part of her psychological condition. Dr. Martinez, you've seen this pattern before in patients with severe anxiety disorders." His attempt to turn Dr. Martinez into an ally was strategically sound, but based on outdated information. He was operating under the assumption that she still believed in my mental instability, unaware that the evidence I'd presented had fundamentally altered her professional assessment of my condition. But Dr. Martinez was already shaking her head, her clinical judgment contradicting Michael's desperate attempt to maintain his deception. Actually, Michael, this documentation aligns perfectly with what I observed during Emma's treatment. Her symptoms never followed typical patterns for anxiety disorders. They were inconsistent in ways that suggested external causes rather than internal psychological factors. Her statement was professionally devastating, undermining months of carefully constructed narrative about my mental health. Dr. Martinez wasn't just any observer. She was the treating psychiatrist whose diagnosis had been central to Michael's entire strategy. Her reversal of assessment carried enormous weight with everyone present. Furthermore, Dr. Martinez continued, examining another document from my folder. The timeline of symptoms correlates precisely with the dates referenced in these communications. The cognitive testing anomalies that concerned me during her evaluation make perfect sense in the context of unauthorized medication administration. Each professional observation she made built a stronger case for the deliberate nature of my psychological symptoms. The cognitive testing that Michael had encouraged, believing it would establish my incompetency, was actually providing evidence of drug-induced impairment in an otherwise healthy mind. Rachel made the mistake of trying to defend herself, her voice rising with the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed life was collapsing in real time. "This is insane," she declared, looking around at the assembled crowd as if seeking support for her outrage. "Emma's obviously having some kind of breakdown. Michael would never do something like that." Her protest might have been more effective if she hadn't immediately contradicted herself by demonstrating detailed knowledge about my medical situation that she shouldn't have possessed as a casual acquaintance. "How do you know about Emma's breakdowns?" Dr. Martinez asked with the sharp attention of someone trained to notice inconsistencies in people's stories. "Her medical information is confidential, unless you've been involved in her care or had access to private information through unauthorized means. You wouldn't know details about her psychological episodes." The question exposed Rachel's involvement more effectively than any accusation could have. Her face went through a series of expressions as she realized she had just confirmed her intimate knowledge of my private medical situation. Knowledge that could only have come from Michael or direct participation in my psychological torture. "I just meant," Rachel began, then stopped as she realized that any explanation would only deepen her apparent involvement. Her confident facade was crumbling under professional scrutiny, revealing someone who had never expected to be held accountable for her participation in psychological warfare. James Reed, Michael's brother, stepped forward with the grim expression of someone whose family loyalty was being tested against mounting evidence of wrongdoing. His presence added another layer of complexity to the situation, as his assessment would carry particular weight given his relationship to Michael and his previous expressions of concern about my mental health. "Michael, I need you to explain this clearly," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who wouldn't accept evasive answers. "Are these accusations true? Have you been making Emma sick to cover up an affair?" The direct question from his own brother forced Michael to abandon any remaining pretense and reveal the calculating nature that had been hidden beneath his devoted husband performance. His response was perhaps the most chilling moment of the entire evening. "Everything I did was to protect our family's reputation," he said, his voice hardening with defensive anger. "Emma was becoming suspicious and irrational. I needed to establish her unreliability in case she started making wild accusations about my personal relationships." His admission sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd, confirming their worst fears about the scope of his deception. But Michael's response also revealed the depth of his narcissistic thinking, suggesting that he genuinely believed his actions were justified by his need to protect himself from consequences. The phrase, establish her unreliability, was particularly damaging, revealing that his campaign against my mental health had been conducted with specific legal and social objectives. This wasn't passionate crime or impulsive behavior. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to preemptively discredit me as a witness to his infidelity. So you systematically drugged your wife and made her think she was losing her mind to cover up your affair? Patricia Williams asked, her voice carrying the incredulous outrage of someone witnessing behavior beyond her comprehension. I was trying to prevent a messy divorce that would have ruined both our reputations, Michael replied, apparently still believing that his motives made his actions reasonable. If Emma had been declared mentally incompetent, we could have handled everything quietly without destroying our social standing or affecting my business relationships. His casual discussion of orchestrating my mental incompetency declaration was perhaps the most chilling revelation of the entire evening. Michael hadn't just been covering his affair. He had been systematically working to have me declared legally incapable of managing my own affairs, effectively stealing my autonomy along with my sanity. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps of horror echoed through the gathering as people processed the implications of what they'd just heard. This wasn't just infidelity or even psychological abuse. It was a calculated attempt to destroy someone's legal capacity for self-determination. Dr. Martinez's professional outrage was evident in her response. Michael, what you're describing constitutes severe psychological abuse and possibly criminal behavior. The deliberate administration of psychiatric medications without consent could have caused permanent neurological damage. The dosages and duration you're implying could have resulted in cognitive impairment that might never have fully resolved. Her clinical assessment of the potential consequences added another layer of horror to the revelations. I hadn't just been the victim of infidelity and gaslighting. I had been subjected to medical experimentation that could have caused lasting brain damage. The stakes of Michael's deception were far higher than anyone had initially understood. The fact that Emma's cognitive function has improved so dramatically since these interventions ceased is actually remarkable, Dr. Martinez continued, her professional analysis providing real-time vindication of my mental competence. Her recovery pattern is consistent with someone whose symptoms were artificially induced rather than naturally occurring. Each statement she made built a stronger foundation for my credibility while simultaneously demolishing Michael's carefully constructed narrative. The woman who had been dismissed as mentally unstable was being professionally validated by the same psychiatrist whose diagnosis had been used to question her reliability. The crowd's reaction shifted from shocked curiosity to genuine anger as the full scope of Michael's crimes became clear. These weren't just marriage problems or even simple adultery. They were calculated attacks on a woman's fundamental mental capacity and legal autonomy. Tom Wilson, the neighbor who had witnessed my confusion at family gatherings, stepped forward, with obvious guilt about his previous assessment of my condition. Emma, I owe you an enormous apology, he said, his voice heavy with regret. We all thought you were having mental health problems, but you were actually being poisoned by someone who was supposed to protect you. His acknowledgement opened the floodgates for similar apologies from others who had witnessed my apparent psychological decline and accepted Michael's explanations about my condition. Person after person approached to express their horror at learning the truth and their regret for not recognizing that I was being victimized rather than mentally ill. Dr. Susan Chen, who had earlier expressed sympathy for Michael's burden in dealing with my condition, now looked at him with undisguised revulsion. Michael, how could you do this to someone who trusted you? How could you watch her suffer and seek help for problems you were deliberately creating? Her questions echoed the sentiments of everyone present. The man they had admired for his patience and devotion was revealed to be a monster who had tortured his wife while accepting praise for tolerating her manufactured suffering. Rachel made one final attempt to distance herself from the conspiracy, claiming that she had been manipulated by Michael and hadn't understood the full scope of his psychological warfare. Her defense was desperate and unconvincing, particularly given the evidence of her active participation that Dr. Martinez was still examining. "Rachel, I have documentation of your discussions about my therapy schedule and your suggestions for avoiding detection during your encounters," I said, producing additional printouts from my folder. "You weren't manipulated. You were a willing participant in a plan to destroy my mental health for your own convenience." The additional evidence was devastating to her credibility. Email exchanges showed her making specific suggestions about timing their meetings around my medical appointments, expressing concern about maintaining secrecy, and even joking about my apparent psychological symptoms. Her level of involvement was too extensive and detailed to be explained by manipulation or ignorance. "You discussed my medication schedules with Michael," I continued, reading directly from printed emails. "You helped plan encounters during my therapy sessions. You even suggested ways to make my symptoms appear more severe to medical professionals. This wasn't passive involvement. This was active conspiracy." Each revelation prompted additional gasps from the assembled crowd. Rachel's image as a respectable professional woman was being systematically destroyed by evidence of her participation in psychological torture. The community members who had welcomed her into their social circles were realizing they had been entertaining someone capable of unspeakable cruelty. Her denials became increasingly desperate as the evidence mounted, but the crowd had already reached their own conclusions about her culpability. A woman who would participate in systematically drugging another woman was beyond redemption in their eyes, regardless of her motivations or level of involvement. The revelation continued to ripple through the gathering as people shared their observations with new understanding. Incidents that had seemed like evidence of my mental instability were being reinterpreted as signs of deliberate sabotage. My confusion at social events, my memory lapses during conversations, my apparent paranoia about being watched all made perfect sense in the context of systematic psychological manipulation. "I remember thinking it was strange how your symptoms seemed to come and go so unpredictably," observed Margaret Foster, a retired nurse whose medical background gave her perspective on typical patterns of mental illness. "Real anxiety disorders usually have more consistent presentations. Your episodes seemed almost random, which makes sense now if they were being artificially triggered." Her professional insight provided additional validation for the artificial nature of my symptoms. The inconsistency that had puzzled medical professionals was actually evidence of external manipulation rather than internal psychological dysfunction. Dr. Martinez had finished reviewing all the documents in my folder, her expression grave as she processed the full scope of what had been revealed. "Emma, this evidence suggests a level of premeditation and coordination that goes far beyond typical domestic abuse," she said. "The sophistication of this psychological manipulation campaign indicates extensive planning and potentially criminal intent." Her assessment elevated the situation from personal drama to potential criminal matter. The systematic nature of the abuse, combined with the evidence of coordination and planning, suggested crimes that warranted prosecution rather than simply divorce proceedings. Michael's demeanor had changed completely as he realized the magnitude of his exposure. The confident husband who had been accepting sympathy for dealing with his troubled wife was replaced by someone calculating legal strategies and considering escape options. His mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the cold manipulator who had orchestrated months of psychological torture. "Everyone's overreacting," he said, his voice carrying a different quality than before. "Emma's been unstable for months. These documents could be fabricated as part of her psychological condition. You can't seriously believe that I would poison my own wife." His attempt to maintain his innocence was undermined by his previous admissions, but more importantly, it demonstrated his continued willingness to gaslight me even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. The man who had just confessed to orchestrating my psychological destruction was now denying it had happened, revealing a level of pathological dishonesty that was breathtaking in its audacity. Dr. Martinez's response was swift and authoritative. "Michael, these documents include independent laboratory verification of drug presence, timestamps that correlate with reported symptoms, and communication records that demonstrate coordination and planning. This isn't fabrication. This is comprehensive documentation of systematic abuse." Her professional authority carried enormous weight in contradicting Michael's desperate attempts to discredit the evidence. The same medical establishment that he had used to validate my supposed mental illness was now confirming the deliberate nature of my symptoms and the criminal behavior he had employed to create them. The evening's social dynamics had completely shifted. Michael and Rachel, who had arrived as respected members of the community, were now pariahs surrounded by people who viewed them with disgust and horror. The transformation was complete and irreversible, their reputations destroyed as thoroughly as they had attempted to destroy my sanity. Country club security arrived as the situation escalated, summoned by staff who recognized that the gathering was witnessing something that required professional intervention. The presence of uniformed security officers added an official dimension to the proceedings, suggesting that criminal behavior had been exposed rather than simply personal drama revealed. "We're going to need statements from everyone involved," announced the head of security, a retired police officer whose demeanor suggested extensive experience with serious situations. "This appears to involve criminal activity that will require proper investigation and documentation." The prospect of police involvement sent both Michael and Rachel into visible panic. Criminal charges would transform their exposure from social embarrassment to legal jeopardy, with potential consequences that extended far beyond damaged reputations. Michael made one final attempt to control the narrative, addressing the crowd with the persuasive skills that had made him successful in real estate. "I understand how this looks, but you all know me. You know the kind of person I am. Emma's been struggling with mental health issues, and sometimes people in her condition create elaborate explanations for their symptoms." His appeal to personal relationships and prior reputation was strategically sound, but fatally undermined by the evidence that continued to accumulate. Dr. Martinez was still examining documents, finding additional confirmation of the systematic nature of the psychological abuse with each new piece of correspondence. "Michael, your emails reference specific medical terminology and treatment protocols that indicate sophisticated knowledge of psychiatric manipulation," she observed. "This isn't the work of someone dealing with a spouse's mental illness. This is evidence of someone who studied psychological warfare techniques and implemented them systematically." The clinical nature of her assessment was devastating to any remaining sympathy Michael might have retained. The picture she painted was of a calculating predator who had researched and implemented sophisticated torture techniques against someone who trusted him completely. Rachel's final collapse came when Dr. Martinez discovered email communications that revealed her background in pharmaceutical sales, providing professional knowledge about psychiatric medications that explained the sophistication of their drugging protocol. "Ms. Torres, your professional background in pharmaceutical sales gave you specific knowledge about lorazepam dosage, timing, and detection avoidance," Dr. Martinez noted. "This wasn't casual participation. You brought professional expertise to the systematic drugging of another person." The revelation that Rachel had contributed professional pharmaceutical knowledge to the conspiracy added another layer of premeditation and criminal sophistication. This wasn't crimes of passion or opportunity. It was carefully planned psychological warfare conducted by people with specialized knowledge and resources. The evening concluded with Michael and Rachel both being escorted from the venue by country club security, their departure witnessed by the same social circle that had previously admired Michael's devotion to his troubled wife. The dramatic reversal of their public standing was complete and irreversible, their reputations destroyed as thoroughly as they had attempted to destroy my sanity. As they were led away, I felt an overwhelming sense of vindication that went beyond simple satisfaction. The truth had emerged not through elaborate revenge schemes or dramatic confrontations, but through the simple power of documented evidence presented at the right moment to the right audience. The medical records that Michael had encouraged me to compile, believing they supported his narrative of my mental instability, had instead become proof of his systematic crimes. In the weeks that followed, the legal consequences proved as devastating as the social fallout. Criminal charges were filed for assault through drugging, fraud related to the falsified medical narrative, conspiracy to commit financial crimes through the planned competency proceedings, and domestic violence enhanced by the systematic nature of the psychological abuse. The evidence I'd compiled provided prosecutors with an airtight case that eliminated any possibility of plea bargaining or reduced charges. Michael's admission at the charity event, witnessed by dozens of prominent community members, made denial impossible. Rachel's pharmaceutical background and documented participation elevated her charges to the same level as Michael's, despite her attempts to claim manipulation. Dr. Martinez testified about the sophisticated nature of the psychological abuse and the potential for permanent damage from sustained exposure to unprescribed psychiatric medications. Her professional testimony helped establish the severity of the crimes and ensured that both defendants faced appropriate consequences for their actions. The level of psychological manipulation documented in this case represents some of the most sophisticated domestic abuse I've encountered in my professional practice, she told the court during sentencing proceedings. The systematic nature of the drugging, combined with environmental manipulation and social gaslighting, created a comprehensive assault on the victim's mental faculties that could have resulted in permanent psychological damage. Her testimony was crucial in securing maximum sentences for both defendants. Michael received 12 years in federal prison for multiple felony counts related to systematic poisoning, fraud, and domestic violence. Rachel received 8 years for conspiracy, assault, and professional misconduct related to her pharmaceutical expertise. The medical testing I'd undergone during my apparent psychological decline proved crucial for legal proceedings, demonstrating the baseline of my mental capabilities and the timeline of artificial symptom induction. The cognitive assessments that Michael had encouraged, believing they supported his narrative of my instability, actually provided clear evidence of drug-induced impairment in an otherwise healthy mind. The contrast between my test results during the drugging period and my performance after the medication ceased was stark enough to provide compelling evidence of artificial causation. Dr. Martinez's follow-up evaluations showed complete resolution of cognitive symptoms within weeks of the poison exposure ending, proving that my problems had been externally caused, rather than internally generated. My recovery was remarkably rapid once the drugging stopped, and I was no longer subjected to environmental manipulation. Within weeks, my cognitive function returned to baseline levels, my memory problems disappeared, and my confidence in my own perceptions was fully restored. The transformation was so dramatic that it provided additional evidence of the artificial nature of my previous symptoms. The teaching position I'd feared losing became a source of renewed passion and purpose. My students, who had witnessed my struggles during the worst periods of manipulation, were amazed by my recovery and increasingly inspired by my resilience. The experience of surviving psychological warfare had given me insights into human nature and survival that enhanced my ability to connect with young people facing their own challenges. "Mrs. Reed, you're like a completely different person," observed Sarah Martinez, one of my advanced placement students. "Last semester you seemed so scattered and uncertain, but now you're more focused and confident than ever. It's inspiring to see someone overcome whatever you were going through." Her observation reflected the sentiment of many students who had watched my apparent decline and remarkable recovery. My classroom became a place where discussions about resilience, truth, and personal strength took on deeper meaning because students had witnessed firsthand what recovery from systematic abuse could look like. The school administration, initially concerned about my fitness to continue teaching during my psychological crisis, now held me up as an example of professional resilience and personal strength. My experience had transformed from a liability into an asset, demonstrating that surviving targeted psychological warfare required extraordinary mental toughness and emotional intelligence. 6 months after the charity event revelation, I stood in my new apartment surrounded by belongings that reflected my authentic tastes rather than Michael's preferences. The space was filled with natural light, books arranged according to my own organizational system, and artwork that spoke to my personal aesthetic rather than maintaining someone else's image of sophisticated decoration. The contrast between my new living space and the home I'd shared with Michael was striking. Every element of my previous environment had been chosen or approved by him, creating a physical space that reflected his preferences rather than mine. The apartment I now inhabited was smaller, but felt infinitely more spacious because it represented genuine personal choice rather than accommodation to someone else's vision. My bookshelves contained volumes I'd chosen for personal interest rather than social impression. The artwork on my walls reflected my own aesthetic preferences rather than Michael's idea of what would impress visitors. Even small details like throw pillows and kitchen utensils represented authentic personal choices made without consideration for anyone else's approval or judgment. The financial settlement from the criminal proceedings provided resources for rebuilding my life, according to my own specifications. Michael's real estate assets were liquidated to pay restitution, providing compensation that acknowledged the systematic nature of the abuse I'd endured. The money couldn't undo the psychological damage, but it provided practical resources for creating a new life free from economic dependence on my abuser. The final irony came when Michael's legal team attempted to argue that his actions had been motivated by genuine concern for my mental health, suggesting that he had been trying to help me by documenting my psychological problems. But the very medical records he had encouraged me to compile became the evidence that proved his deliberate sabotage and demonstrated my complete mental competency. The woman who had been dismissed as mentally unstable became the credible witness, whose testimony sent her abusers to prison. The medical documentation that was supposed to prove my incompetency instead demonstrated the sophisticated nature of the crimes committed against me. Most satisfying of all, the social circle that had pitied Michael for dealing with his troubled wife now understood him to be a criminal who had tortured an innocent woman for his own convenience. Standing in my sunlit kitchen on a peaceful Saturday morning, exactly 1 year after the charity event that changed everything, I realized that justice had been served not through revenge or elaborate schemes, but through the simple power of truth supported by irrefutable evidence. Michael had spent months constructing an elaborate fiction about my mental health, never realizing that he was actually creating the documentation that would expose his crimes and prove my sanity. The experience taught me that sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't retaliation, but simply allowing truth to emerge in its own time and speak with its own voice. The medical records that seemed to confirm my mental decline actually proved the deliberate nature of my symptoms. The cognitive testing that appeared to document my incompetency instead demonstrated the effects of sustained drugging on an otherwise healthy mind. I learned that resilience isn't about avoiding damage, but about surviving it with enough clarity to recognize truth when it finally surfaces. The woman who had been systematically gaslighted and medically abused emerged stronger, wiser, and completely vindicated by the very evidence her abusers thought would destroy her. The psychological recovery process was more complex than the physical healing from the medications. Months of questioning my own perceptions had created deep patterns of self-doubt that required conscious effort to overcome. Even after the truth was revealed and my abusers were imprisoned, I found myself second-guessing decisions and seeking external validation for choices I would have made confidently before the abuse began. Dr. Martinez continued working with me through this recovery process, helping me distinguish between appropriate caution and pathological self-doubt. Your hypervigilance about your own mental state is actually a rational response to having been systematically deceived about your cognitive function, she explained during one of our sessions. learning to trust your own perceptions again after such sophisticated manipulation takes time and conscious practice. The therapy sessions took on a completely different character once we understood the true nature of my previous symptoms. Instead of treating anxiety and cognitive dysfunction, we focused on trauma recovery and rebuilding confidence in my own judgment. The work was challenging, but infinitely more hopeful than the futile attempts to address artificially induced problems. "Your recovery trajectory is remarkable," Dr. Martinez noted 6 months after the truth emerged. "The speed with which your cognitive function returned to baseline, combined with your ability to gather and present evidence of the abuse, demonstrates exceptional mental resilience. You survived sophisticated psychological warfare, and then orchestrated your own vindication through methodical documentation and strategic revelation." Her professional assessment helped me understand that surviving Michael's campaign required strength I hadn't known I possessed. The woman who had been targeted for psychological destruction had actually demonstrated extraordinary mental toughness by maintaining enough clarity to recognize patterns, gather evidence, and plan effective response strategies. The legal proceedings provided their own form of therapeutic closure. Testifying about the systematic nature of the abuse forced me to articulate the full scope of what I'd endured, helping me process experiences that had been too overwhelming to examine while they were occurring. The courtroom became a place where my voice was heard, believed, and validated by an official system of justice. "Ms. Chen," the prosecutor addressed me during my testimony, "can you describe for the court how the defendant's actions affected your ability to function in your professional responsibilities?" The question allowed me to detail not just the personal suffering I'd experienced, but the broader impact of the psychological warfare on my career, relationships, and fundamental sense of self. Speaking these truths in an official setting, with court reporters documenting every word for the permanent record, felt like reclaiming my narrative from people who had stolen and distorted it. "I began to doubt my competence as an educator," I testified. "I questioned my ability to serve my students effectively, worried that my apparent cognitive problems would interfere with their learning. I considered taking medical leave from a job I loved because I believed I was becoming unreliable and potentially harmful to the young people in my care." The impact statement I delivered during sentencing proceedings became one of the most empowering experiences of the entire ordeal. Standing before the court with Michael and Rachel forced to listen, I was able to describe the full scope of their crimes and their consequences not just for me, but for everyone who had been deceived by their elaborate deception. "Your Honor," I addressed the judge, "the defendants didn't just commit crimes against me. They weaponized our entire social circle, turning friends and family into unwitting participants in psychological abuse. They corrupted medical professionals who were trying to help someone they believed was genuinely ill. They violated the trust that makes marriage possible and the honesty that makes community life viable." My words carried weight, not because they were dramatic or emotional, but because they were supported by comprehensive documentation and professional validation. The truth had power that no amount of manipulation could overcome once it was properly presented and officially recognized. The broader community response to the revelations continued to evolve in the months following the legal proceedings. Initial shock and outrage gradually transformed into deeper reflection about the nature of psychological abuse and the difficulty of recognizing sophisticated manipulation when it's occurring. Golden Oak Country Club implemented new policies about domestic violence awareness and support for members who might be experiencing abuse. The charity that had been honored at the fateful fundraiser where the truth emerged established a fund for survivors of psychological abuse, recognizing that this form of violence often receives less attention and resources than physical assault. "Emma's case opened our eyes to forms of abuse we hadn't fully understood," explained Janet Morrison, the charity's board chair. "The sophistication of the psychological manipulation she endured demonstrates that domestic violence can take forms that are nearly invisible to outside observers, but devastatingly effective in destroying victims' sense of reality. My story became a case study used in medical and psychological training programs, helping future professionals recognize signs of artificially induced mental health symptoms. Dr. Martinez collaborated with medical schools to develop educational materials that would help clinicians identify patients whose psychological distress might be caused by deliberate sabotage rather than natural illness. The Chen case demonstrates the importance of considering external causation when patients present with inconsistent or atypical symptom patterns, she wrote in a professional journal article. Mental health professionals must be aware that sophisticated psychological abusers can create symptom presentations that closely mimic legitimate psychiatric conditions. Her academic work ensured that my experience would contribute to preventing similar abuse of other victims. The medical records that documented my suffering became teaching tools that might help future targets of psychological manipulation receive appropriate help rather than treatments that addressed artificially created problems. The personal transformation that resulted from surviving and exposing the abuse extended far beyond recovery to my previous baseline. The experience had forced me to develop insights into human nature, manipulation tactics, and personal resilience that made me more perceptive and confident than I'd been before the ordeal began. "You seem different now," observed Lisa Park, my best friend who had watched the entire crisis unfold. "Not just back to normal, but stronger and more self-assured than I remember you being even before everything happened." Her observation reflected feedback I received from many people who had known me both before and after the psychological warfare. The process of surviving systematic deception had developed my ability to trust my own perceptions, recognize manipulation tactics, and maintain boundaries that protected my mental and emotional well-being. The dating process, when I eventually felt ready to consider new relationships, was informed by hard-earned wisdom about recognizing healthy versus manipulative relationship dynamics. I'd learned to identify love bombing, gaslighting, and other psychological manipulation techniques that might have been invisible to me before experiencing their most sophisticated applications. "I know what real support looks like now," I explained to Dr. Martinez during one of our sessions. "I understand the difference between someone who encourages me to seek help for genuine problems and someone who creates problems to make me dependent on their support. I'll never again mistake control for caring or manipulation for love." The professional recognition I received for handling the situation with such effectiveness was unexpected, but deeply validating. Educational organizations invited me to speak about resilience and survival, while legal advocacy groups asked me to share insights about gathering evidence and building cases against sophisticated abusers. "Your methodical approach to documenting the abuse and planning your revelation provides a model for other victims," explained Sarah Williams, director of a domestic violence advocacy organization. "Many people in similar situations feel so overwhelmed and confused that they can't imagine taking effective action. Your example demonstrates that even in the midst of systematic manipulation, it's possible to maintain enough clarity to fight back effectively." These speaking engagements became opportunities to transform my personal trauma into resources for other people facing similar challenges. The skills I'd developed for surviving psychological warfare could be taught to others who might need to recognize and resist manipulation in their own lives. The relationship I eventually developed with David Chen, a fellow educator I met at a conference about trauma-informed teaching, was built on foundations of honesty and mutual respect that would have been impossible before I learned to recognize authentic care versus manipulative control. "I appreciate that you never try to convince me I'm wrong about my own experiences," I told him early in our relationship. "After what I went through, having someone trust my perceptions and support, my judgment feels like the greatest gift possible." David's response demonstrated the kind of relationship dynamic I'd learned to value. "Your insights and experiences are part of what makes you who you are," he replied. "I would never want to undermine your confidence in your own mind." That confidence is hard-earned and should be protected. Our relationship developed slowly and deliberately, with both of us committed to maintaining individual autonomy while building genuine partnership. The contrast with my marriage to Michael was stark. Where Michael had gradually isolated me and undermined my independence, David encouraged my self-reliance and celebrated my strength. The wedding ceremony we eventually planned was intimate and focused on celebrating our commitment rather than impressing observers. The guest list included only people who had supported me through the darkest period of my life, creating a celebration that honored authentic relationships rather than social obligations. Dr. Martinez attended the ceremony, her presence symbolizing the professional support that had been crucial to my recovery and vindication. Watching Emma rebuild her life with such wisdom and strength has been one of the most inspiring experiences of my professional career, she told guests during the reception. She demonstrates that trauma can be transformed into wisdom when it's processed with courage and support. The contrast between my two wedding experiences couldn't have been more profound. My first marriage had been built on illusions and manipulated emotions, with elaborate social displays masking fundamental dishonesty. My second wedding celebrated genuine love built on mutual respect, honest communication, and shared commitment to each other's well-being and growth. 5 years after the charity event that exposed Michael's crimes, I received a letter from the parole board requesting input about his potential early release. The opportunity to provide a victim impact statement for parole consideration allowed me to reflect on the long-term consequences of his actions and my perspective on appropriate consequences for systematic psychological abuse. The defendant's crimes weren't impulsive acts of passion, but calculated attacks on my fundamental mental capacity and legal autonomy, I wrote to the board. The sophisticated nature of the psychological manipulation he employed, combined with his continued attempts to gaslight me even after being caught, demonstrates a level of dangerous manipulation that requires extensive rehabilitation before any consideration of release. The parole board ultimately denied Michael's request for early release, determining that his crimes were too serious and his rehabilitation too incomplete to warrant reduced punishment. The decision felt like final validation that the justice system understood the severity of psychological abuse and the long-term impact it can have on victims. Rachel's similar request for early release was also denied, with particular attention paid to her professional background in pharmaceutical sales and the way she had weaponized that knowledge to facilitate systematic drugging. Her specialized skills made her particularly dangerous to future potential victims, requiring completion of her full sentence plus extensive professional rehabilitation. The nonprofit organization I eventually established, the Truth and Trust Foundation, focused on education about psychological manipulation and support for survivors of sophisticated abuse. The foundation's work combined professional training for healthcare providers, educational resources for potential victims, and advocacy for legal reforms that address the unique challenges of prosecuting psychological abuse cases. Emma's case demonstrated that psychological abuse can be just as devastating as physical violence, but it's often much harder to recognize and prosecute, explained our foundation's mission statement. We work to ensure that survivors of psychological warfare receive the support, validation, and justice they deserve. The Foundation's educational materials helped countless people recognize manipulation tactics in their own lives and relationships. Workshops about gaslighting, love bombing, and other psychological abuse techniques provided practical tools for identifying and resisting sophisticated manipulation before it could cause lasting damage. 10 years after the revelation that changed everything, I stood before a conference of mental health professionals presenting research about the long-term recovery process for survivors of systematic psychological abuse. The woman who had once been dismissed as mentally unstable was now considered an expert on resilience and recovery, her insights sought by professionals and survivors alike. The key to recovery isn't just stopping the abuse, I explained to the assembled clinicians. It's rebuilding confidence in your own perceptions, learning to trust your judgment again, and transforming the survival skills you developed during the abuse into strengths you can use throughout your life. My presentation concluded with the same message that had guided my entire journey from victim to survivor to advocate. Truth has power that no amount of manipulation can ultimately overcome, but that power must be carefully documented, strategically, presented, and officially validated to achieve justice and healing. The fairy tale marriage I thought I'd lost had actually been a carefully constructed nightmare designed to benefit everyone except me. The real happy ending came not from finding perfect love, but from discovering my own strength, wisdom, and ability to survive even the most sophisticated attempts to destroy my sense of reality. In the end, Michael's greatest mistake wasn't falling in love with another woman or even conducting an affair. His greatest mistake was underestimating the intelligence and resilience of the woman he was trying to destroy. The medical records he encouraged me to compile became the proof of his crimes. The psychiatric treatment he insisted I needed provided the professional validation of my competency. Most importantly, the systematic documentation of his deception became the foundation for justice that was as complete as it was inevitable. Standing in my home office, surrounded by awards for advocacy work, letters from survivors I'd helped, and photographs from a life rebuilt on foundations of truth rather than manipulation, I realized that the most profound victory wasn't the imprisonment of my abusers or the vindication of my sanity. The greatest triumph was the transformation of devastating trauma into wisdom, strength, and resources that could help prevent other people from experiencing similar suffering. The woman who had been systematically gaslit and medically abused had become someone who could recognize manipulation from across a room, support others through their darkest moments, and stand as living proof that psychological warfare, no matter how sophisticated, cannot ultimately defeat truth when it's supported by courage, documentation, and strategic presentation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.